Duke Ellington was the grandson of slaves. Louis Daniel Armstrong was born in a New Orleans slum so tough it was called the battlefield. William James Basie grew up in a world unfamiliar to his white fans, the son of a coachman and a laundress. Author Larry Tye says the Duke, the Count, and Satchmo transformed America. The book is called The Jazzmen, and Mr. Tye writes, how better to bring alive the history of African America in the early to mid-1900s than through the singular lens of America's most gifted, engaging, and enduring African American musicians.
Hi there, I'm Jonathan from C-SPAN, along with my colleague, Ben. Since C-SPAN's founding 45 years ago, the media world has changed. Remember when there were just a few TV channels? Now we've got streaming, social media, apps, and more.
Through all of this, C-SPAN has stayed true to its mission of giving you unfiltered access to government wherever you get your news. As we navigate this challenging media environment with fewer people subscribing to traditional cable packages, our funding has been impacted.
That's why we're asking for your help to keep going strong for another 45 years. Please donate today at cspan.org/donate. Your contribution, large or small, helps ensure at least another 45 years of witnessing democracy in action.
Keep C-SPAN thriving in today's ever-changing media landscape. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Thank you.
Larry Tye, tell us when it all started, when you started thinking about Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington, and why?
So I've been thinking about them most of my life, but when I started thinking about them in terms of a book was when I wrote an earlier book on some black men who worked on the railroads called Pullman Porters. And these guys were extraordinary. These are men who went to work for George Pullman at the end of the Civil War and continued for 100 years. And they made me promise two things: that when I got done writing about them, that someday I would write a book on their favorite sports figure that they ever carried on their trains. And several years ago I wrote a book about Satchel Paige. And then they made me promise that I would someday write a book about their three favorite passengers, three guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And they were their favorites because the Pullman Porters, when these three band leaders earned enough money, they would take private Pullman sleeping cars with them when they went below the Mason-Dixon line. And they did that not just because it was a luxurious way to travel, but at night, after their concerts, when they were playing in a Jim Crow community, rather than worrying about whether going into the wrong hotel or restaurant would get them beaten up or worse, they knew that if they went back to their private Pullman car, which was pulled off on a railroad track in Atlanta or in anywhere they went across the South, they knew they would get a great meal, they knew they would get a great night's sleep, and in return, what they did for the Pullman Porters was they would run all-night jam sessions in this incredible closed capsule of a railroad car. And if I could go back to any moment in American history over the last 100 years, I'd want to be there in one of those jam sessions in a Pullman sleeping car.
We can come back to this, but let's start by talking about each of the three. Give us some background on Duke Ellington.
Sure. So Duke Ellington grew up exactly 125 years ago. He was born 125 years ago in Washington, D.C. And Washington then was, on the one hand, one of the largest black communities in America and one of the wealthiest black communities in America. And yet it still had lots of the Jim Crow traditions. It was a border town, and it had some of the best of the North and some of the worst of the South going on there. And Duke Ellington grew up in a middle-class household. His mother played the piano and thought it was wonderful that Duke had an interest in the piano, but Duke had an interest in everything. And he could as easily have been a sign painter or a pool hustler or all kinds of things, because he dabbled in all of that and decided at some point that the thing he did best was to plunk the keyboards of a piano, and that's the way he could make a name and make money.
From the start to the finish, how many years did he have a band on the road?
So it was a full 50 years. And that was, aside from the fact that all three of these musicians were born within a 5-year period, one of the other things that united them was that they all had careers that lasted an inconceivable 50 years.
He said something to almost every audience, and I want to play it so everybody can hear it and ask you to tell us to put it in context. Here is Duke Ellington talking.
And so by routining one's finger snapping and choreographing one's earlobe tilting, one discovers that one can become as cool as one wishes to be. With that, we certainly want to thank you for the wonderful way you've inspired us. Remind you that you are very beautiful, very sweet, very gracious, very generous, and we do love you madly.
How often do you think he said that in his life?
So how many concerts did he perform, and how many attractive women did he meet? He was incredibly gracious, he was incredibly elegant, and he was incredibly over the top just about everywhere he performed. And he did love his audiences, and he did love women, and he did love embellishing.
Did you ever see him in person?
I regret to say I never saw him in person.
What about Louis Daniel Armstrong?
Yes. So I have to sort of correct you because we're never sure where that Daniel came from. It clearly wasn't on his birth certificate. It wasn't anything that his 17-year-old mother gave him when she gave birth to him in a part of New Orleans that was so tough that it was known as the battlefield. And he grew up in poverty. He grew up with an incredible love from his mother and nothing much at all from his father. And he grew up much like the character that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Satchel Paige, where his savior in terms of keeping him alive and in terms of learning a profession that would last his lifetime, came like with Satchel Paige in reform school. He was sent at age 13 to a reform school known as the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, and it was not a fun place to be, but thankfully it had a band director who saw the talent in Louis Armstrong, and he started out with what amounted to a tin horn. He ended up transitioning to the cornet, and he eventually played the trumpet the way nobody on earth knew the trumpet could be played. He hit high notes even at that young age that were unbelievable, and he showed that he had a skill that would not only keep him out of reform school, but would keep him in the money and would make him as recognizable a figure, an American figure, as Mickey Mouse was. They used to say that the two most recognizable Americans anywhere you went around the world were Louis Armstrong and Mickey Mouse.
In those early years, how much trouble did he get in?
As much as he could, as much as anybody could imagine that a young boy could. He was out on the street basically trying to earn his living and supplement his mother's meager income for him and his young sister by blowing a horn on the streets, by doing whatever hustle he could think up. And he actually did so much hustling, and he had such a large mouth that was the way he earned one of his favorite monikers, which was Satchel Mouth. It became shortened eventually to Satchmo, but he would hide the pennies that he earned on the streets in his mouth. And thankfully, he had a big mouth, and thankfully, he was very good at earning those pennies.
Anybody that ever saw him, and of course you can see it in pictures, sees what happened to his upper lip because of the trumpet, cornet. What did happen, and how much trouble did it give him?
It gave him perpetual trouble. What happened was it became so overused. By blowing those high notes, he was taking a toll on his lip. And it was such overuse that you could at times see his white shirt turn red with blood. And at one point, a doctor said, "You have to stop playing and you may never be able to go back to playing." Well, he did stop for a little while. He did go back. And what was the magic that worked on his lip was a salve that he ordered, this cream he ordered from Germany. And his lip became so famous, and this remedy became so famous, that the German manufacturers renamed it Satchmo's lip salve.
Have you ever seen Louis Armstrong in person?
So I hate to say this again. I never saw him play, and again, a huge regret. I never saw any of my three maestros, which is what made it such a joy to go back and spend 3 years living with them and watching them endlessly on tape and listening to them at night when I went to sleep and in the morning when I woke up.
By the way, I never heard the name Daniel as his middle name, but I took it from the flap in your book. Why did they put it in there if it didn't exist?
So they put it in there because that was what all of his biographies suggested it was, only the closer you looked, the more you realized that was a name that he just added on because having a middle name seemed like something somebody ought to have. But back in those days, and especially in Jim Crow America, just finding his birth certificate was an impossibility, and therefore he could create whatever age he wanted. When he wanted to be younger, he would just take a few years off of his age, and when he wanted to be older, he would add a few years. And it was partly in good fun, but it also, in my mind, was his way of poking fun at a world of Jim Crow that gave a pack animal a better sense of a biography left behind than it did a young black born in the Jim Crow era after the Civil War.
The third character in your book, if we can call them characters, William James Count Basie, was where was he from? What was he about?
So one of our guys was from deep in Jim Crow America, Louis Armstrong in New Orleans. One of our guys was from an area that was sort of a border area in Washington, D.C. And Count Basie was from a small community called Red Bank, not far outside of New York, in New Jersey, in what was clearly the northern part of the United States, but also had laws and practices that made growing up black in that era in the late 1800s, early 1900s, not a whole lot easier than it was in Jim Crow America.
So what was his family like?
So he adored his mother. He tolerated his father. He had a younger brother who died when he was 12 years old in a very sad case of meningitis. And he had, thanks to the extraordinary potential these days of genealogy to find out things that people wanted to have buried, I found out that he had a second brother who died of malnutrition before his parents were married, and that became a family secret. And it was sort of part of what it was like growing up in that era, that it was difficult to earn a living, it was difficult to provide for your kids. And in the case of the Basies, they were delighted that one of their three children survived and thrived. But Billy Basie, or Willie Basie as he sometimes called himself in those days, couldn't wait to get the heck out of Red Bank, and it was his piano playing skills that let him do that.
One of the most interesting parts of your book was what you told us about the way Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, kept archives, did oral histories. Explain that.
So partly he came from a world where his history was so uncertain that he wanted to tell the world what his real history was. Partly he just loved talking, and whether it was talking to his audience or talking to a tape recorder, and he wanted to leave behind his story, not leave it to journalists or biographers like me to tell what really happened to him. So he wrote 3 memoirs. He left behind hundreds of tapes, thousands of hours of taped interviews of himself, of anybody who came into his house. Sometimes he told them the recorder was on, sometimes he didn't, but he was just having fun. And Louis Armstrong, better than anybody I've ever seen, knew how to have a good time.
How much of that did you either listen to or read?
I listened to endlessly. I read more of it. I tried to listen to everything that he had ever taped or written. But if I had done every one of his tapes, I'd be here for the next 10 years trying to complete the biographies. I read the highlights of everything he did, and I read every word of his memoirs, and every one of hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews that he gave reporters. He loved to tell stories.
So if the general public wanted to find all of this, could they get access to it, and where?
They could either visit or go online and at the Louis Armstrong House and Museum. So his house was turned into a museum, and they've built an extraordinary library across the street that opened about a year ago. And if you go online and look for the Louis Armstrong House and Museum, lots of the stuff is available virtually. And if you go to the Louis Armstrong House and Museum, you can not only listen to the tapes and read things that he wrote, you can look at his famous toilet seat, you can look at his specially designed kitchen. He wanted to live not in luxury that he showed off the way he was living. His house looked like any house in the neighborhood, but indoors it had all these special touches that said this is all about Louis Armstrong, including a study where he had every one of the most advanced form of tape recording equipment that was available then out there, so he could tape things that people said or that he said.
Why was his toilet seat famous?
It was famous because Louis Armstrong was fascinated with his digestion, and he took every day of his life a packet of something called Swiss Chris, which was a laxative, and he took in earlier days other homemade remedies that his mother had taught him, and he actually had his business cards embossed with a picture of him on a toilet seat saying his famous words, "Leave it all behind you." And he was fascinated with what he took in and was determined to let out everything that he took in and do it in a way that he said cleared his stomach and cleared his mind.
If there's the Louis Armstrong house, what is there for Duke Ellington?
So for Duke Ellington, there are all kinds of exhibits at the Smithsonian Museum. He's the most celebrated musician there, and I suggest that people go and live there. I wish that his house had been turned into a museum, but if you're really lucky, like I was, you will get a tour of Harlem from his 85-year-old granddaughter, Mercedes Ellington, who took me to everywhere that Duke played, everywhere that he lived, everywhere that he stashed his mistresses, and that was the longest part of our tour. And we ended up in a place called the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And what is special about Woodlawn is that Duke was buried there next to his parents, next to the favorite of his many mistresses, across the street from Miles Davis, and down the hill from half of the great jazz musicians in America. And I'm convinced that if you and I were to go there at midnight on any given night, we would hear an amazing jam session of all these musicians who wanted to come together in death and maybe in an afterlife.
You do spend a lot of time in your book about the women in all three of these men's lives. Start with Duke Ellington. What was his relationship to women?
So his relationship was that he got married at a young age. He had a son that may or may not have been conceived before he was married, and probably it was before he was married. And he had a marriage that lasted a sadly very short period of time. The good parts of the marriage only lasted for a couple of years. The marriage lasted a lifetime, but it lasted a lifetime because his wife was delighted that Duke was taking care of him financially for the rest of his life. And she knew, and he knew, that if he kept that marriage, it gave him an excuse with all of his mistresses why he wasn't marrying them. So it was a marriage of convenience that lasted a lifetime, but that was good for only a couple years. All three of them had endless affairs. Louis Armstrong was married 4 times. Once of those four, his last one was a good marriage, but even with a good marriage, he had affairs, and his wife knew about it. And every time she found out about an affair, she would end up with a new full-length mink coat or some new renovation of their house. She understood who Louis was. She understood that in the end, he came back to her, but he was on the road in bad years for as many as 300 or 365 days, and that was simply more time than he could remain faithful to a wife. And sadly, the same thing was true of Count Basie. And his wife actually did leave him, but she, like Louis's wife, eventually came to understand who he was, understood that he gave her everything she wanted except for fidelity, and all three of them, to me, understanding this idea that they were breaking that one of the 10 commandments along with a couple others was making them more flesh and blood. In the end, they were every bit as much a hero as they started out with me, but in the end, I realized all their foibles.
Let's listen to some music just briefly. That tune, Take the A Train, played what role in Duke Ellington's life?
So it was his signature song. It was partly a reflection of the fact that he loved trains. It was partly a reflection of the fact that during one of the strikes by the musicians' union, when Duke wasn't allowed to have his tunes that he had composed on the air, he asked his son, Mercer Ellington, and a guy who became his protege, Billy Strayhorn, to compose some music for him. And Billy Strayhorn, when he first came to interview with Duke, Duke told him how to get by train to where Duke was living. And he turned those directions into a song called Take the A Train. And from the earliest days of his working with Billy Strayhorn to the end of his life, that was his most recognizable tune. And for all these black musicians, not just because of their relationship with the Pullman Porters, but because trains represented to that era of African American freedom and somehow getting away from all the strictures of their lives. And trains were romantic, and they became a part of the music of all three of these musicians, as that song reflects.
Take for a moment to talk about the other book that you've written on Pullman. Who was George Pullman, and how did he treat his Pullman Porters?
So there are two ways to answer that question. First of all, who George Pullman was he was a guy around the end of the Civil War who wanted desperately to become rich. And he tried every scheme that he could think of. He tried setting up a business to move houses. He tried all these money-making schemes. Nothing worked. And he then decided one day, maybe when he was taking an uncomfortable train ride, that if he could come up with a comfortable train that people could take on long trips, including cross-country trips, that he could make a fortune. And it worked. He designed trains that had sleeping quarters that were as comfortable as the best hotel, that had food as good as the best restaurants, and for an ungodly fare, you could take these trains across the country and have a great adventure. He also realized that he needed the perfect servant to take care of people when they were going across country, who would shine their shoes, who would press their pants, who would keep their mouths zipped when people went on these long trips and ended up in the berth of somebody other than their spouse. And the Pullman Porters had gotten the equivalent of their PhDs in servitude, because the Pullman Porters that he hired were all ex-slaves. And he hired them, he charged a fortune. When people got done taking these trips on the Pullman sleeping cars, it wasn't the luxury of the travel, it was the service that they got that they most remembered. And that's who George Pullman was. And the Pullman Porters, on the one hand, he realized that if he paid them not quite enough to earn a living that they would depend on tips. And if they depended on tips, they were sure as heck going to give you everything that you, as their passengers, wanted on these long trips. So they ended up more than doubling their salary with the tips that they made. Now, was George Pullman a good guy or a bad guy? On the one hand, he gave these black men what ended up being the best jobs a black man from that era could get. They ended up earning, with their tips, larger salaries than any black men of that time got. They got to travel the country in the way that no blacks, other than maybe Negro League ball players, could do. And yet he knew that exploitation was at the center of everything that he was doing. And he was partly a good guy and he was partly a bad guy. And depending what day you asked a Pullman Porter, they'd either rail against him or celebrate him.
More sounds from that era. That's a tune called Scoot. Count Basie, maybe not his most famous song, but how do you describe his music?
So I describe it in the way that his bandmates did. And what they said was, if by the end of listening to Count Basie's band play an entire concert or a single song, if your toes weren't tapping, then you ought to go to a doctor the next day because something was wrong with you anatomically. He had an ability to make people get up and dance and to make them feel good about the music they were hearing and about themselves that no band leader that I ever heard about could do, which is why he lasted on top of the world for a full 50 years. And his music came out of Kansas City, which is where he really got launched. And it was called Kansas City Swing, and there was no better performer of Kansas City Swing than William Count Basie.
What was he like?
So in the early days when he was playing in Kansas City, he started out at a hole-in-the-wall place called Club Reno. And he was a bit of a drunk. His clothes all had patches in them, and he was a ne'er-do-well. And his first marriage failed because he would come home drunk and poor much too often. But he learned over time how to refine his tastes in everything from music to clothes to how to drink or not drink and show that you were drunk. He was an extraordinary, understated, but in my mind, elegant guy. He had, though, one bad vice, and that vice was he loved the ponies. So as soon as he would get into a new town, as soon as the band arrived in a new town, he'd put on his old captain's hat, he'd flag a cab, and he'd end up at the racetrack. And sadly, he was not a very good gambler, and many a night his band went without their paycheck because Count Basie had left it all at the racetrack.
One more tune to listen to.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
As you know, Larry Tye, that's a very commercial tune. Everybody today probably recognizes it. When did he first play it?
So he first played it in the very end of his career and end of his life. And it was the tune, along with Hello Dolly, that he was best known for. And it was interesting because whereas the other two were going from Tin Pan Alley, Ellington and Basie, to tunes that were more soulful and more reflective of the things that they could do because they were so successful, Louis Armstrong went in the other direction. He started out with his most artistic and soulful songs, and it was almost exactly 100 years ago that he performed in a shoebox-sized portable studio inside the Loop in Chicago. He performed the recordings called the Hot Fives that would change jazz forever. But by the end of his career, he was asked to do popular tunes, and he did them. And his popular tunes actually put him in the Guinness Book of Records. His Hello Dolly recording it knocked the Beatles in the 1960s off the top of the Billboard charts and made him, at age 62, the oldest #1 ever in the history of Billboard.
Did the three of these men know each other?
They did know each other. They said anytime a reporter asked incredibly nice things about one another, but they almost never played together. And I think that was for a couple reasons. One is because why would you have two headliners on the same stage? It was too expensive for bookers to book them together. But also, if you had egos like all three of these men did, you didn't want to share the spotlight. And if you were Louis Armstrong, why would you invite up Duke Ellington, maybe the one person in the world who was as famous and celebrated a musician as you? Why invite him up if you could have the stage all to yourself?
You weave in and out of your story of these three the race issue and difficulty in those times. I'm going to read what you wrote on page 312. Jim Crow had restricted where the Count could sleep, eat, or simply be, even when he was, as he wrote, quote, the hottest attraction in the biggest theaters and auditoriums or the top night spot in town. I already knew about all of that beforehand, just as you would just have to know about what you would go through to become a prize fighter or a football player. I'll just say that I was not surprised when things got strange in one way or another. I'll just say that I didn't intend to let anything stop me if I could help it, and that should tell you something. Tell us more about what they lived through in those early years.
So they lived through the indignities that every black of that racist era in America lived through. What that meant was, especially when you were below the Mason-Dixon line, being told that this is a water fountain that you can use and this is one that is off limits to you because you're black, or as they were called then, Negro or colored or all kinds of worse things. It meant being told whether you could play on the stage of a nightclub in Las Vegas, let's say, didn't mean that you didn't have to enter that building through the kitchen because you were considered hired help. You were black. It was living in a segregated world where you got not only things that were separate, but institutions that were unequal. And what it meant was suffering extraordinary indignities, even though America sent you around the world as their jazz ambassadors. And I mean literally, the State Department sent these men around the world to celebrate a country that considered them second-class citizens.
How often, when they played in a hotel, they couldn't stay there overnight?
Much too often, for a good part of their careers. And they didn't take it sitting down. They didn't take it the way black entertainers and black celebrities generally did. Most people took it as part of the way America was, and they had to accept it. What you read from Count Basie, who was the most understated of the three of them, Count Basie started putting into his contracts that he would not play to segregated venues, and starting in the 1940s, at a time when that was just unheard of in America. And they pushed back against the strictures of Jim Crow in a way that did two things. One, in a way that let them stand up for their own dignity and push back against the limits, but also in a way that transformed America. Figures all across the civil rights world, and most notably Martin Luther King, said that these three men, by bringing their music into white households that would never have let a black man cross that threshold, that they set the table for what he would later do in pushing for the integration of schools and baseball fields and everything else in America, that it was through the music world, through the jazz world specifically, that the soundtrack was written for the civil rights revolution in this country.
We were talking about monuments to these three men. What about Count Basie? I know there's a jazz museum out in Kansas City. Is there any place where all of his papers are or where he's celebrated?
Yes. So there are three places that you want to go if you want to hear anything or see anything about Count Basie. One is, as you mentioned, in Kansas City, where there's a wonderful jazz museum, and Count Basie is up front in that jazz museum. There is the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University, where all of Basie's papers were left. And there is the Count Basie Art Center in his hometown of Red Bank, where again, his legacy is celebrated.
How much do people pay attention to this today? I'm talking about all three of them and their archives.
So not as much as I hope they will. And I think that we ought to pay attention to them partly because their music is still keeping our toes tapping even 125 years after Duke Ellington was born, 120 years after Count Basie was born, and 100 years after Louis Armstrong made those Hot Fives. Their music still inspires jazz musicians and all kinds of musicians, but more importantly, the story of what they did in pushing back against Jim Crow is one in these days where race is back front and center in American discussions. We ought to understand their role.
Page 304 in the book, you say they also demonstrate that near the end, he was thinking about more than music and joy. Quote, the Negroes always hated the Jewish people who never harmed anybody, but they stuck together, he wrote in Louis Armstrong Plus, The Jewish Family. By doing that, they had to have success. Negroes never did stick together, and they never will. They hold too much malice, jealousy deep down in their hearts for the few Negroes who tries. What are we talking about there? What's that quote from?
We're talking about two things. That is from the third of his memoirs. It was done in tribute. It was dedicated to a family named Karnofsky, a family of Eastern European Jewish emigres who ran a rag business. They peddled old clothes on their wagon that they drove through the streets of New Orleans. And the way they drew attention to their wagon was they hired a young African American named Louis Armstrong to blow a tin horn that they gave him. And he blew it with such impact that it helped make their business more successful, but more importantly, they considered him their almost adopted son. Louis lived in a home where it was just his mother, where she was out working much of the day, where it was poverty, and he felt that he learned a lot of the values that he took away from New Orleans from this Karnofsky family. And in honor to them, he not only dedicated this most important of his memoirs, but he wore around his neck a Star of David for the rest of his life. And I think that story is important, not just because it tells us something about Louis Armstrong, but I think in an era where there are tremendous tensions these days, often between the black and Jewish worlds, going back, looking back at that era of the 20th century where there was a black-Jewish alliance, I think is a story of inspiration and a story of maybe how to reforge those kinds of ties. It is not accidental that all three of our jazz maestros, Armstrong, Basie, and Ellington, had Jewish managers. It's not accidental that they had lots of Jewish bandmates, and many of their closest friends were Jews. And that's because blacks and Jews were both outsiders. They both learned to tell their stories through music, and they both had very few avenues open to them. They couldn't get jobs at white shoe law firms or advertising agencies, but they could get jobs writing comic books, which is why the creators of Superman and Batman were Jewish, and they could get jobs in an outlying part of the music world like jazz. They did, they bonded, and it was a very important part of all their lives.
It's hard to believe that the last time we talked was 26 years ago, when you were a guest on Booknotes for a book called The Father of Spin, about Eddie Bernays, the father of public relations. How many books have you done since then, and was that your first?
That was my first. The one on the jazz guys is my 9th. And all I can say is that every book I keep saying is my most fun. And at the time I'm saying that, I'm telling the truth.
What about your book on Bobby Kennedy in 2016? What was that all about?
So it was a book looking at Bobby Kennedy's life and career. But I think you're being very polite and you're saying, why did the world need the 101st biography of Bobby Kennedy? And my book was a tiny bit different because I looked at how this guy who died in 1968 as a liberal icon, how he had started life as a protege of Senator Joseph McCarthy, and how he went, his transformation from Cold War conservative to liberal icon reflected and mirrored the country's transformation from 1950s Eisenhower era America to the tumultuous 1960s. And I was so fascinated by that McCarthy-Kennedy relationship that I ended up years later writing a biography of Joe McCarthy.
What did you find about him that we didn't know?
So what I found about him, when McCarthy died, his widow left all of his personal and professional papers to his alma mater, to Marquette University in Milwaukee. And she left them with a provision that they would stay under lock and key until either their daughter, who was an infant at the time McCarthy died, until the daughter died, or until she decided to open them up. And she was younger than me, and I realized she was going to outlive me. And I tried every trick in the book to get access to those papers. I knocked on the daughter's door. I wrote her letters. I had her best friend write to her on my behalf. I did everything in the world, and she kept saying no to me. And then I tried something that is the only form of sort of bribery that would be acceptable in the book world. I gave up on ever seeing those papers, and I sent her a note with a 6-pack of Grater's ice cream, the best ice cream in America. And my note said simply, I don't want to leave a sour taste in your mouth. Here's a bit of sweetness. I promise never to bug you again. The next week, I got a call from the archivist at Marquette saying, we don't know why, but the daughter has decided to open up all the papers to you. The day you stop looking, they're going to go back under lock and key. So what I found out, this is a long-winded answer to your question, what I found out was that Joe McCarthy, for all that we assumed that he never knew how to tell the truth, on some of the most important things in his life, like his being a World War II Marine Corps hero, he was telling the truth. But it also, his records helped me trace how increasingly in his life he learned that telling a big lie, he suffered no more damage than telling a little lie. So over time, he learned to tell whoppers. And I saw the most famous speech that he had ever delivered, which was a speech on Lincoln Day, where he held up a sheaf of papers in his hand and said that he had a list of all the communists in the U.S. State Department who were betraying the country, his country. I saw all the various drafts of that speech. And what he was holding up that day may have been a list of groceries that his wife wanted him to get at the store, but they sure as heck weren't a list of 115 or 105 communists in the U.S. State Department, because that list never existed. And McCarthy set the model, my book argued, for all the demagogues who came afterwards on how to tell a lie, on how to take on your enemy by trying to destroy them. And we can guess some of the people in American history who learned the McCarthy lesson.
Where are you talking to us from today?
I'm talking to you from beautiful Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where I live about 10 miles from the Kennedy compound in Hyannis, and where I'm looking out to what a day that might actually be the real beginning of spring. Every day we think is that this time of the year, and it's where I write my books in a basement study, but where, unlike with the McCarthy book, which came out in the middle of COVID, and had me giving all my book talks from the same lonely basement. In a week, I go out on the road and I'm doing what will end up being at least a 10 city tour, doing 50 to 100 live talks, and I can't wait to be out there talking to people.
How much of your life's income came from books, and do you have another responsibility?
So I have another responsibility. Anybody who tries to write books, unless your name is Stephen King, should have a day job to go along with the night enterprise of writing books. And my day job is I run a fellowship program for health journalists. We're going into our 23rd year. We've trained 250 of the best health journalists all across America. And every year we bring in 13 of them, and we bring in the smartest doctors and government officials who were involved with health issues and try to make them a little bit better at covering issues like pandemics and things like mental health that go undercovered.
Go back to the three principles from your book. What was their life like at the end? And what I'm really getting at first and foremost is how much money did they have when they died?
They had more money than just about anybody in Black America had. They had enough that they were taking care of lots of relatives, lots of friends. They were living incredibly comfortably. And while I wish they had lived another 15, 20 years, they lived to what then were the ripe old ages of 70s and 80s. They lived in comfort. They lived with their bands still together, and they lived delighting every journalist or anybody who went to hear them play unto their dying days.
Is there an accounting anywhere of exactly how much they were worth?
There is. There's an accounting in my book where I tried to take every figure that I could get my hands on and account for inflation and account for embellishment and tried to put it together. And they were what we would consider today at least millionaires, and they were among the only Black millionaires of the era.
Health. At the end of their life, who was the most unhealthy during the normal life? And then at the end, how did they all pass?
So one of the things that is extraordinary about their having the long careers that they did and staying relatively healthy for all their lives is the incredibly unhealthy lifestyles they lived. Count Basie loved smoking cigars and eating unhealthy food. Louis Armstrong smoked marijuana just about every day of his adult life. Duke Ellington ate meals that began with grapefruit, and that was the only healthy thing that he put in his stomach. He ended up eating 2 or 3 steaks every meal. He liked having 3 pieces of cake, each topped with ice cream. These guys lived lives on the road of staying up too late at night, putting the wrong things into their stomach, and the idea that they lived was extraordinary. The one who showed the most clear-cut signs of how unhealthy he was in his later life was Count Basie, who got around on a motorized scooter because his arthritis was so bad and had a couple heart attacks, and he showed the toll. But again, he lived older than he ever dreamed that he would live, and in the end, he was still living comfortably.
What about the health of Louis Armstrong?
So he spent a lot of time in his later years in the hospital, but even there, he managed to have fun. He outlived his manager, Joe Glazer, who was dying on an upper floor of Beth Israel Hospital in New York when Louis Armstrong was being treated on a lower floor. He had heart issues all of his later career and life, but he managed to defy Mother Nature and lived a long life.
Duke Ellington, what did he die of?
He again died of lung and heart issues, which isn't surprising when you think of the smoky nightclubs that these people were living in half the days and all the nights of their life. The idea that even if they didn't have bad smoking habits, which they did, the idea that they were breathing in fumes and inhaling alcohol and living in these unhealthy settings, the idea that Duke would have lung issues and heart issues is not surprising, and the idea that he would die of emphysema is not surprising.
Some odds and ends before we wrap it up. The story of Count Basie's daughter, Diane.
So an extraordinary story. They give birth to a daughter who is disabled in 5 different ways. She had physical and mental disabilities, and yet the Count's wife, Catherine, was determined that she was not going to be treated as somebody who had disabilities that wouldn't let her do things that every other kid in their neighborhood did. So she taught her how to swim. She taught her how to express herself, not verbally, but make clear what she wanted and needed. And the Count went out and earned enough money that for the rest of Catherine's life, and she died just a year ago, for the rest of her life, she had round-the-clock care, she lived in elegant surroundings, and she was well taken care of.
That reminds me to ask you, who did you talk with that were the most helpful to you in writing the book that might have had a connection to them, who were, sons, daughters, relatives?
Yes. So I talked to a total of about 250 people. In the case, for instance, of Count Basie and trying to understand what was going on with Catherine, I talked to kids who lived in the neighborhood that Catherine grew up in. I talked to the woman who was appointed as her guardian ad litem and who was taking care of all of her needs for the rest of Diane's life. I talked to bandmates. I talked to relatives. I talked to friends. I talked to biographers. I talked to just about everybody that I could think of in my long career as a journalist that you'd want to talk to. And like every book that I wrote, people told me you should have been here 20 years ago. And like every book that I wrote, there were a whole lot more people who knew the intimate details of their lives than I had been led to believe when I started my research.
You say that Duke Ellington had a short fuse.
He did. So he had a short fuse because he had a lot that he had to get done. He was composing songs, he was arranging songs, he was playing the piano, he was a band leader, and so he didn't have time for all the crazy things his bandmates would do in terms of getting into trouble with their drinking, with their drugs. He had people in the band who helped him, but people knew that if Duke lost his temper with you, you were in deep trouble. So they knew not to push him too far. And having a short fuse proved to be a convenient thing in getting out the word that he wasn't somebody to be trifled with.
Which of the 3 band leaders had the best relationship with their fellow orchestra members?
So that's easy. It was Count Basie because he was one of them. Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington were world-renowned figures, and everybody knew them, everybody recognized them, and they were the stars of any band that they played with. Count Basie's band was much more democratic. While he was clearly in charge, it was Count Basie and his orchestra, and that was always the way he billed himself, and that was the way the world thought of him. They thought of him as a band leader, whereas Duke Ellington, they thought of him as a composer, and Louis Armstrong was all about his trumpet and his singing. And he, by the way, was maybe the most famous voice in America at that time, and yet it was a voice that, by any conventional standards, wasn't a melodious voice. And in Chicago, when Louis Armstrong was coming up in the world, his voice became so famous that kids would go out without coats on, trying to get a cold so they would sound like they could mimic Louis Armstrong, that it was just some magic in the way that his timing with his voice and the way that voice just became symbolic for everything that Louis Armstrong represented.
Which one of the band leaders told his orchestra members to hide their deformities?
So that was, sadly, my guess is, while we attribute that to Duke Ellington, it was probably true for all of them, that in those days, they were subject to all the same biases that everybody had about disabilities. They were subject to the same biases that most men in America had back those days in terms of gender issues. And the women who played in the band, on the one hand, were almost certain to be vocalists, because instrumentalists was something that just was not especially open to women in that era, and especially to black women. So they were sexist, they were not open-minded about lots of things, but they were also barrier breakers in ways that I think is the way we really ought to know them.
Who was called an Uncle Tom?
All of them were. The one who was called an Uncle Tom by far the most was Louis Armstrong, because he would go out and ham it up on stage. He would go out with his handkerchiefs, he'd go out huffing and puffing, and he thought that there was no inconsistency with being an entertainer and being an artist. And I think that he showed the world how you could be both at once. Yes, he did ham it up. Yes, he played a lot of tunes from Jim Crow era, including one of his signatures from the early days when it's sleepy time down south. But yes, he did more than just about anybody in the world back then to break down racial barriers. So the idea of calling him an Uncle Tom was suggesting how little we knew, not how little he knew.
What's the story about the burned sheets in Lynchburg?
So when black musicians would stay in a hotel that allowed whites in, one of the many signs of a racist reaction to that was that the proprietors would at least say that they actually went in and burned all the sheets. It was part of this Jim Crow separation and part of the indignity that black musicians had to endure.
Let's go over the names again. Why was William Basie named Count?
He was named Count. There are two stories on it. One is the one that he tells, which is that he actually that he had once been called Count for some inexplicable reason, and he loved the name so much that it stuck with him. But every one of these nicknames, had three stories on where it came from. And I think that it was just a sense of his nobility that his bandmates realized that he was this elegant guy, and they gave him the name Count, and it stuck. Duke Ellington actually, he used to say that it was one of his schoolmates from grammar school that gave him the name Count. I think that he gave himself the name. When he was a kid, he would come down the stairs in his house in Washington, D.C., and he would insist that his young cousins say, "Here comes the great, the grand Duke Ellington." And he had a sense of nobility that he bestowed upon himself, and he ultimately lived up to it. But I think he was probably the one who came up for the first time with his name as Duke. And Louis Armstrong's names, he had a dozen of them, from Satchel Mouth to the one that he liked best, which was the shortened versions of that, Satchmo. He was also called by his mother Louis. He was called by several of his wives Louis. What he said in the end was, "I don't care what you call me as long as you call me in time for the meal."
He, and maybe the other two, but he more than any of them called people cats.
He did. He called them cats. So there was an entire lexicon in the jazz world. They were a different kind of musician. They wanted, like kids who learn Pig Latin, or parents who speak their native Yiddish or Italian or German in the house so the kids can't understand. These jazz musicians developed their own lexicon that they would know and that none of their patrons would understand. And cat was one of the words that they used, and it became such a familiar expression that their patrons used it, they used it, and being king of the cats was what all these three guys were, and they loved being called that.
Now, when you were leading up to writing this book, did you consider putting anybody else in your book besides Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie?
I did, and I took surveys of all the smart musicians that I talked to, from Wynton Marsalis to John Batiste, and it was clear that these three were the ones who, if Mount Rushmore of jazz only had room for three, it would be these three. They also had the poetry of being born so close to one another, of all having careers that lasted half a century, and of all being civil rights pioneers. My one challenge was there a woman who should it have been something other than Jazzmen? And the answer was, back in those days, sadly, while there were wonderful vocalists, there was no band leader among women who rivaled them. The one who came the closest was a woman named Lil Hardin, better known as Lil Hardin Armstrong, Louis Armstrong's second wife.
How often, and this will be the end of our discussion, did you listen to their music while you either researched or wrote?
As often as I could. When I wasn't on my computer, I had their music playing in the background, and I still listen to it. When I'm trying to wake up or when I'm trying to go to sleep, the thing that jazzes me the most is listening to these three maestros, and I presume it does you too. And it's been, I hate the idea, in the last question you said it's the end of our conversation, but I want to say you have everything that I remembered and I thought I had glorified from 29 years ago, you have proven true. You are the most prepared interviewer I've ever experienced.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you for this book, The Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. Larry Tye, our guest.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.